This week, I excitedly continued my Torment build. It was a choice between a bunch of smaller scatter pieces or one big dramatic centerpiece. And well, I decided to go with the one big centerpiece. I started by getting some fresh silicone to mold those beautiful Greco-Roman style pillars that would be the thematic backbone of this entire set. Thankfully, this time around, the silicone was fine and I was able to make really nice usable molds. I spent the weekend beforehand casting as many pieces as I could with plaster. I also broke out some of my tile molds that I'd made last year for my Frostgrave boards to act as dump molds. These are from my original sculpts and they're a great way to pour out excess plaster to create pieces of brick that I could break up later to use as pavers or even wall sections. This was actually my first time using plaster to cast with. Usually I work with resin, but the plaster seemed far more appropriate as I'd be able to easily break it up as needed. The other prep work I did in advance was printing out an epic model from this week's sponsor, and boy oh boy, it's a perfect centerpiece. As luck would have it, Archvillain's theme this month is epic demons, so how perfectly fitting for my hellscape build. Every model in this set is a massive sized demon, and I chose this rock model, which is by far the biggest piece I've ever printed. This model is so damn cool, and I was thrilled that all parts printed and assembled with no issue. Even the base is amazing. Like normally I'd sculpt my own base, but I loved all the little candle details that were decorating this one, and I knew it would be a perfect thematic fit for this piece. With Big Daddy Demon Boy all printed up and a bunch of plaster pieces cast and ready, I could start thinking about the layout for this grand piece. And this was pretty easy and organic. The pillars just seemed to want to surround the demon in a sort of shrine. This is a character model meant to be used as a playable creature, but damn if it won't make one hell of a beautiful monument. I figured I'd need about a 12-inch circle base for this, which is easily the biggest base I've ever made or used for scatter terrain. So I grabbed some 1/4-inch MDF and went out and cut out a circle and sanded the edges to a nice smooth bevel. The nice thing about a big circle like this in a very stable material like MDF is that there would be little to no risk of it warping. Now, as cool as this model's base was, I didn't think it was quite tall enough for the epic scale I was going for here. I wanted it to tower over the piece and models on the battlefield. So I grabbed some thick XPS foam and got to work carving up a larger rock for it to stand on. I only needed to get a rough shape here as I knew I'd be covering everything in Sculptamold shortly. Sculptamold seemed to be in very short supply and hard to get this past year where I live, so I'm really thankful that a kind viewer from Wisconsin sent me up a care package a couple months ago of several pounds of the stuff, allowing me to jump into a big set like this without worrying about wasting it. So if you're watching, James, thanks again. It's going to your really good use. After gluing the foam and the model with some of that really good glue from Geek Gaming, I got to work covering the rock in Sculptamold. I was really tempted to cover the entire base and set the pillars out right at this point, but I knew that would be a bad idea. The thing about Sculptamold is that it's really tricky to sculpt into hard edge rock-like shapes when it's first applied. It's just too soft. The trick is that you have to let it sit and cure for a bit and find that sweet spot where it's mostly stiffened up but can still be worked with tools before fully hardening. For this reason, I knew I couldn't put those pillars in place as they would just be in my way as I tried to sculpt that rock. What I could do at this point was cover some of the base areas with Sculptamold and some of those broken bits of stone flooring and plaster that I had prepared. And once the time was right and the Sculptamold was ready, I used a damp popsicle stick to carve in some more realistic rock shapes that would better blend with the printed base. And then I could get to the exciting part and start laying out all the pillars and various bits of decoration. I really love working with Sculptamold as a foundation like this because you can just push big things into it and they bond really well without any extra glue. For some smaller rubble, I use some decorative broken glass that you can get from IKEA. This is meant to go in like flower vases or something, but it works great for rubble. And I just pushed it into the Sculptamold. I wasn't confident that these little pieces would all bond well without any extra glue, but I wanted to test it out just to see. I could then get to work dropping on some various pieces of weapons and items to decorate this hellish battlefield. Now, some people were wondering on last week's video where all these bits are from. Where did I get all these bits? Well, they're from all sorts of different places. They're really just various pieces from different minis and kits that I've randomly collected over the years. Some of them are from big model sets I've bought and never used, and many are from boxes of just random stuff that friends or viewers have given me over the history of this channel. This is all stuff that's just been sitting and waiting to be used, but for some reason I've always been reluctant to cut this stuff up and use it just as bits. I always felt like I needed to save them until the time I could just assemble and paint the models the way they were intended. But with this project, that mindset has all changed, and it's been really liberating to no longer feel that reservation about hacking up things that have just been sitting in dark boxes for ages. They may never end up being the completed models that they were intended to be, but this way they'll all be given a life on the gaming table and given a chance to fulfill some sort of gaming destiny nonetheless. The next day, when everything was dry and cured, I gazed upon this piece and I was incredibly proud of it. The only issue was that a lot of that little rubble that I didn't glue wasn't quite stuck very well. But as I said, it was a test and I simply removed any loose pieces before painting, and honestly, it wasn't that many. Now, before I paint this creation, let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this video. If you want some of the biggest, baddest, most detailed 3D printable miniatures on the market, well, Archvillain Games is what you need. Every month they release a themed set of stunning minis for tabletop games, and this month the theme is demons. These are massive models. If you're already running a resin printer, there's no question you should be signed up to Archvillain's service. It's a no-brainer. If you're a gamer, it's great value. If you're just a modeler or just a painter, it's great value. If you just want to use it for terrain bits, it's great value. If you're on the fence about getting into printing, stop. What are you waiting for? Just do it. You can be set up with a resin printer and supplies for a couple $100 and be pumping out endless amazing models like these. And if you're worried about how complicated it is to run a printer, don't be. I've put in next to no effort to learn this process. I've been super lazy about it. And in a year, I've only had one failed print and I've only had to clean out my machine once. And that's thanks to pre-supported files that you get from services like Archvillains. It's seriously just plug and play. The value you get is really remarkable. And if you want to throw a couple extra bucks onto your monthly pledge, you even get access to fully fleshed out and well-designed content for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. So you can easily use these models in your games. $10, all these models. It's worth every single penny. Last week on the first piece of the set, I did a lot of painting steps to see what would work. A lot of messing around and experimenting, but my goal with this piece was to try and reduce that process as much as possible to get similar or hopefully better results. Results that I can replicate on multiple pieces quickly next week when I build more. So I did my flat black prime, followed by a airbrush zenithal highlight. Now, last time I sprayed out all the metallics at this point, but I felt confident I could actually just skip this step entirely and proceed right into airbrushing on some transparent raw umber ink. This tone, after a few coats, would dry to a nice deep rich color that I felt was just perfect for this style. Now, to get the metallic portions looking just a little bit different than the stone portions with less effort, I just broke out some burnt sienna ink and gave those spots a little bit more of a rusty reddish look. In the end, this would actually end up looking more like the rusty iron that I wanted than hitting it with metallics first, which kind of resulted in more of a brassy look last time. The only real downside to these inks is that they're very glossy, which I didn't want. Hell just doesn't seem like a place that would be wet. It's probably pretty warm and pretty dry. So I busted out a can of matte varnish. Unfortunately, it had a clogged tip from the last time I used it because I was probably lazy about cleaning it and it was sputtering like a bastard. But thankfully, I remembered that I actually had a big bottle of airbrush matte varnish that I could switch to instead and save the day. And when I pulled out this giant piece that basically filled my whole spray booth out, I bumped it really hard on the edge of the booth and broke off one of the feathers. This is the only problem with resin on really delicate small parts. They won't survive a really hard hit. But really, that's going to be the same for plastic from GW models, so it's not something I really worry about. I thought about gluing it back on, but then I figured, like, this is a battlefield. I just glued it to the ground and added it to the rest of the rubble. I mean, realistically, maybe maybe I should have broken off a few more pieces in the first place. I can now move on to that magic step that really makes this set come together, and that's the simple beige dry brushing, just with craft paint. You'll notice I didn't do any of the other inks or washes or rust or verdigris I did last time before this step. And honestly, nothing is really lost. It was pretty pointless to do most of that before the dry brushing, and I'm thrilled to have refined this process to this point. Now, to bring a little bit of indication of metal on those rusty pieces, I did opt to do a very minimal gunmetal metallic dry brushing. This is far more efficient and effective than the reverse order I did last time where I painted out the metal first and then washed it and all that. It just gives that little subconscious hint that this is metal to these mostly rusted out old items. Less is more here. It really doesn't take too much. There were a few more pieces of that glass rubble that came off during the dry brushing, but surprisingly it was only a few. Because this revealed raw plaster, raw sculpt mold underneath, it was really easy to touch up with just a tiny dab of brown wash. And I used some of this brown wash really sparingly in the deepest recesses to give a bit more depth and shadow to them. Again, this calculated spot wash after dry brushing is so much more efficient and effective than the all-over washes I did before dry brushing last time. Now, if this were one of the smaller pieces in the set, this painting would be done. But it's the big centerpiece, so I think it deserved some extra details and refinement. And since my favorite part of the demon model were all those little candles, I felt they deserved the tedious task of painting them all out individually. After 2 coats of beige, I gave them a sepia wash. This creates that perfect old waxy candle look. And for good measure, while that dried, I broke out a little bit of the rust paint and did some spot treatments on various little metal bits to differentiate them even further from the stone or rubble. Because these candles were now painted as if they were lit, it really needed some object source lighting. There are really nice ways to do this, and a lot of people are really good at it. I'm not one of those people. No, I simply thin some orange and yellow paint and do my best to highlight the appropriate places with my airbrush. But with this piece being so big and having so many nooks and crannies and the light source coming from a bunch of really small candles below most surfaces, this was pretty hard and awkward to do without going too far, which I certainly did. I did too much, but it was still a decent effect and it looked better than not doing it. And after it dried, I applied a bit of thin brown wash to it and it kind of toned down those highlights quite a bit. One problem though is that I turned all of those really nice sepia colored candles orange in the process because I couldn't be targeted enough to avoid them. So I did have to go back and repaint them white again and then re-add that wash of sepia. This was a bit of a bummer, and next time I just skip that step ahead of time and do the lighting effects first. But in the end, after the touch-ups, it turned out pretty good. What can I say about this piece? It's my favorite thing I've ever made. It's big, it's cool, it's unique, it's pretty original, I think, and I love it. It perfectly encapsulated my vision of hell in this particular aesthetic that I had in my head and was able to translate to physical form, and I'm really proud of that. This whole project has gone from being a creative block to a massive ongoing project that will end up being my personal favorite project to date. I'm really happy about that. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video and are enjoying this series. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and drop me a comment below. This helps encourage the algorithmic YouTube gods and get it shown to more people. And of course, feel free to share it with your friends or your favorite hobby groups. If you want to pick up some tools and supplies for your hobby, maybe tackle a project like this yourself, and you want to help support the channel financially in the process, head over to blackmagicraft.ca and use my essential equipment page to do your online shopping. It helps you get the right stuff that you need, and it helps fund these videos at the same time. The other way you can help fund these videos, if you get a lot of enjoyment and a lot of value out of them, is through Patreon. A few dollars a month on Patreon from a whole bunch of people is the main reason this channel is still existing and going strong and has gone from a guy just messing around to a huge successful hobby YouTube channel and my full-time job. This support is so crucial to the channel and my family, and all that support is greatly appreciated. I'd absolutely love to have you as the newest member of the Black Magic Craft Fellowship. But that's it for this one, guys. I gotta get immediately into work starting to craft the pieces for the next set. Thanks for watching. See you next week.